Hey guys, welcome to tonight's meetup. I can see some people jumping in, and I always love when the first people are people I know. That always makes me feel like this is a little bit more akin to the old world where we were in person and a little bit less like I'm talking to the metaverse. Thank you for joining us this evening. If you don't know me, my name's Kerrin. I work for Betfair in Australia, and I'm responsible for growing automation on the exchange. I head up the automation team here in Australia. I've got Ben and Ivan who are also here in the background. They work with me. And like I said, we're here to try and grow automation in all its forms. So that includes helping with actual automation of strategies, but also helping to make modeling and automation more accessible and helping you to know where to start. So that's where tonight comes in. So there are a lot of people who have conversations with who have strong analytical backgrounds. They've got good skills. They either have an analytical background that will let them build strong sort of Excel models, through to people who are full-blown quants and can do anything with pandas and a decent Python model, but a bit like me, don't necessarily know anything about sport. Honestly, I hadn't watched a single AFL game before I started to work for Betfair. And they said to me, well, where should I start? I want to model sport and I'm intimidated. And I totally get that. And that's where tonight comes in. My answer to that question is, after 5 years in the game at Betfair, is to start with AFL. And there's a whole heap of reasons that we'll go through those this evening, but fundamentally, it is a really accessible sport to model. And if you're new in your sports modeling journey, hopefully it's an interesting place for you to start. So that's why we're here tonight with a couple of my favourite AFL modelers who are lucky enough to join us this evening to share their experiences. So we'll get them on in a bit. First up, though, a couple of things from me. So if you aren't on the exchange already, so I wonder why not, but you're very welcome to join us. I'll get Ivan to drop a landing page link in the chat. This is aimed at tonight with some thoughts about how to start modeling, particularly AFL, and then utilize that on the exchange. So not generic exchange, it's got some links there that might be useful to you. And I'll get Ivan to pop that on. If you're watching this on the recording later, we'll try and make sure it's in the YouTube comments too, the notes, so that you can get it from there. Other pieces, hopefully you've seen one of these before and you're already part of the Betfair Quant Slack group, but if you're not, I strongly recommend you join. It's an awesome community of like-minded people who are all interested in analytics of one form or another, and happy to share their insights and knowledge to make automation in all its forms more accessible. Incredibly engaged community and a great place to have a conversation and meet some people who you might learn something from. I'll get Ivan to drop the link down there, but equally, if you're watching this later, feel free to shoot us an email. automation@betfair.com.au will come to me, Ben and Ivan, and we're always happy to help where we can along the way. My final bit of housekeeping. So what have we got coming up? In April and May, we've got Jared Tendler coming to talk about the mental game of trading and on the exchange more generally. So he's coming, and I'm incredibly excited about those workshops. So they'll hit your inbox soon if you're subscribed to updates from us. Otherwise, keep an eye out. Hopefully you'll see those Eventbrite pages come through. And then finally, way tonight will flow. There is a Q&A box down the bottom of Zoom. Feel free to drop queries in there or in the meetups channel on Slack, and we'll come to those as they're relevant throughout, or we'll get to them in the QA section later in the evening. I promise we will wrap up by 7 because I know that that's kickoff. We did schedule this evening to coincide with the kickoff of the AFL season, and it's hopefully going to be a really good night. So I'll make sure that we finish on time. Without further ado, Ben, could we get Michael on? So Michael Lean, he's one of the first people I got to know individually on the exchange. It's been fascinating to get to know better over the years. Thank you very much for joining, Michael. Very active member of the community. You've been on one of our meetups before back in the day, but I thought when we got around to talking AFL directly, it was very appropriate to have you as part of the conversation, given you have quite a lot of experience now. Could you share a little bit about your background, what brought you to the exchange, what you do when you're not modelling AFL?
Yeah, for sure. So I've got a long history of mathematical modelling, data analysis, curve fitting and optimization in my work life and in my personal life for fun and for dollars. And it was a natural fit, obviously, when I discovered the exchange and how you could automate the modelling and place bets automatically and do a whole bunch of number crunching. Number crunching was my thing, and suddenly it was a perfect match. So that's my work life has been in in mobile phone optimization, in network optimization for mobiles and for traffic networks, and it's now in supply chain optimization. So it's all about optimization, which is what modeling is, and all those sorts of curve fitting things. So my aim tonight for the AFL, and I've been market making for the AFL for Betfair for a while. So when you see some prices appearing,
probably
there
yours
in various prices, they're quite often mine. Sometimes somebody beats me to it, but most of the time, and hopefully through this season, most of those prices that appear there, at least to get the ball rolling, are quite often mine. My aim tonight is to do two things. Is one, to make people realise that if you have an opinion on the price of a market, as in the match odds, you actually have a very calculable opinion on a whole bunch of other score markets. And if you're going to bet on the match odds, then you could bet on the winning margin, you could bet on the total game score, you can bet on the handicap, because they are all linked through a couple of fairly simple formulas. I'm not going to scare people too much, I hope. Some people might be going, I wish I'd paid more attention to my year 12 maths or my first year uni maths. But, stick with me. I've tried to keep it reasonably simple. And I'm more than happy to share other formulas and other calculations later on the Slack channels or anything else. But I want to demonstrate how everything is so completely linked in here.
And what I love about your approach, Michael, and this is not to cast any aspersions on code-based modeling approaches. That's what we'll get to with Robert later. But a lot of yours, as you said, you do a lot of your stuff in Excel, right?
Yeah.
Which for people who are new to A, sports modeling, or B, modeling in general, can be a lot more accessible, right? Because you can visualize it a little bit more than you can something that is a command line program.
I like to touch and feel the data, not that you can touch or feel data. I've always felt that Excel is just immediate. You can see it, you can see the graph, you can see the relationship between numbers. And I have played with some of those other packages. It just doesn't feel the same as Excel to me. So, I'll be dedicated for life to that.
Nothing wrong with it. And I love that, it also, you sharing that, maybe makes it a little bit more accessible as a concept, that it's not just for the, and this is again no aspersions, but the uber quants who are Robert, a whole world away from at least my capacity. So I love it. Excellent. So what have you got for us tonight, sharing some of your insights?
Very good. My part, I'll make the distinction between stats and statistics. Stats are the stuff that Robert's probably going to talk about, which is all about number of disposals and kicks on goal and total player, figures and performance of teams. That's the stats. That's the database. I'm on the statistics, which is all the means and the standard deviations and the probabilities and those sorts of things. So I just make that distinction between the two, and both of them have a very important role in the modelling side, but I'm focused on the stats side. So, just a quick example that that's the total points from 2018 and the spread of results, the variances starting line from 2018. And you can see they form a nice sort of normal distribution when you fit the curve, the total points that have been scored over the course of the season in each game. But the central limit theorem, for those that just care about it, just says that everything's going to approach a normal distribution eventually. We don't quite know what the distribution of a single game of AFL is. We know what the results of a lot of AFL games if we look at them, but we don't know what a single game is. The only real way to know is if you created a whole bunch of parallel universes and ran off and played the game and then looked at the results, and we can't do that, but we can surmise reasonably well. What happens with AFL is it does actually fall within a reasonable normal distribution. But what it does, and I've just shown these here just to scare people, kurtosis, where it gets a bit squashed, the scores get a bit squashed, and the skew up there in the blue where it gets a little bit tailed. With AFL and with any sports game, we're limited in the amount of time and the fatigue as to how far you can go. So eventually, the normal distribution goes off to infinity. You can't have an infinite score in AFL. So eventually you get a limit to how far you can score. And so it gets a bit squashed. And you can see that little picture down in the bottom right. The blue curve is sort of squashed up against sort of about the 250 point mark, because although there's been a few high scoring games in history, most of the time it sort of gets a bit squashed. But while we're playing down in, the main part around the scores are around 160, 170, up to 175 is the expected score. The result of the game tends to be quite normal. And for the sake of somebody starting off in modeling, you can play around with the normal curves and the numbers I'm going to show you and be quite happy that you'll get a pretty accurate model. My point of that. So let's have a look at the AFL. We've got some core game distributions that we know. We know that the winning team is going to have a certain probability of a score. The losing team is going to have a certain score. The total game score is going to be the sum of those two, which is a little green line that's there. And there's a margin. And they're all basically just different versions of a normal distribution. The magic number I'm going to give you tonight, which you can all go home and play with in your own time, is that the standard deviation of that curve is about 22. Okay, it doesn't change much from game to game, from season to season. A little bit of variation, but if you play with that 22, in all these numbers I'm going to give you from here on in, you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff that you can fall out in your models. And so the distribution of that green curve is just simply, you go back to your theory books, it just says the square root of the sum of the square of two of them, and you get 31. So the distribution is 31 for the bigger curves and 22 for the smaller curves. And what that does is it allows us to do a whole bunch of calculations just starting from the match odds, because the match odds then tell us what the handicap will be, what the total game score distribution will be, what the winning margin spread will be, all based on all those nice curves. So here we go with an example from tonight's game. When I grabbed these numbers, the price for Melbourne was about $1.67. Okay, that's moved a little bit now, I think, but at the time it was somewhere between $1.65 and $1.69, so $1.67. So the probability of the home team, Melbourne, winning was 0.599, as in 1 over $1.67. Simple as that. In other words, the probability that the away team plus a margin minus the away team will equal that. And I'll show these formulas to you later, but basically a simple calculation, which I'll throw through there, says that the margin will be 7.8 points. And if you look at what the margin was that everyone was betting on, it was Melbourne minus about 8 points. Okay, so they're all linked. And in fact, we can calculate just with one column in Excel, we can say, well, if the home team is $1.67, we know the prices of all those handicaps. And we could go forth and we could put bets on the exchange at all those different handicaps, simply from the fact that we know what our match odds are, because they all just simply derive from those two curves. As simple as that. So more importantly, if we now go off and say we're going to place a bet, we believe that Melbourne at $1.67 is a good price, okay? We think that $1.55 is the real price from our modelling, from our stats modelling. We suddenly say, well, we can see that what the difference in those prices is. It's a very simple lookup table that anyone can create in either their Excel or their Python or whatever tables they're using to work out what all those different prices are, and therefore put bets on the exchange on the handicap as well as the match odds. Simple step. So the next one is that then bounces off into winning margin. We know our winning margin, 24.5. That's just simply saying that the difference between the two scores is between 0 and 24.5, or that the difference between the two scores is greater than 24.5. All these things just derive. I'll give you the Excel formulas there. Everyone can have this later. And we simply go, well, at that stage, there's the probabilities, there's the prices. And again, that's just a simple formula to all bounce back from that original match odds calculation. So I'll stop there. Just pause just for a second while Kerrin's sitting there nodding and just sort of absorbing all this. But my point is to try to encourage people to go, you know what, if I take a position on an AFL game, because I've done all my stats, that I think the odds should be $1.50, or I think the odds should be $2, you're actually taking a position, or you've got knowledge of all of these other score markets as well, with a very simple calculation.
And the reason to bet into markets other than the head-to-head, obviously there are multiple. Once you get up to the big end of town, when you're trying to get lots of money down, it comes down to liquidity, right? And not, there may not just be the liquidity in one market, but when you're at the more reality end of the spectrum, it's also just that you might find value in one and not in the others, right?
Exactly. It's spreading your risk. Why just go on the match odds when you might actually lose the match, but you could win on the margin spread, or you could win on the try bet because the game was within 15 points, as opposed to, as opposed to a certain team winning. You had a certain odds on the fact that the game was going to be close and be within plus or minus 15 points. So you could put a try bet on using the numbers that you've got from your particular model.
You also might find that some of those markets are more efficient than others. So you may find that actually there's value in betting one of them where there isn't in another. As you said, you could go multiple, but you could also just go the one that makes the most sense based on either the prices available or the prices that you could offer.
Correct. The match odds is usually quite tight as well, but you find quite a reasonable spread on the winning margin spread, try bet, and you'll be able to find some opportunities there where your model can go, okay, yep, I can see I've got an advantage there because I've got a price there. The corporates do the same thing, and I just got to look up here from the corporates. If you take the TAB and look at all of their different lines and look at their prices, that doesn't change. That table there is a straight lookup for, if you go to the TAB right now, if I looked on my phone and they have Melbourne by, say, -9 points, you can look across those figures there, and that will be the prices that the TAB will have on home under 24, home over 24, home under 39. It's a straight lookup. I mean, it doesn't change from year to year, season to season.
You think it's all sophisticated and that it's all complicated, but actually
it's not. So where is the point of difference? The point of difference is when you use your stats and when you use your modeling to come up with an opinion on, I think the match odds should be this, that then flows through to all of these different numbers, and you've suddenly got an opportunity to bet on all of these different things and spread your risk and actually potentially make more money, because if you're right about the match odds bit, then you're right about all these other ones as well.
So let's say that I've got someone listening here who couldn't give two hoots about AFL and doesn't necessarily know anything, hasn't a clue what are behind, or doesn't know you're saying 120 X point. Why is that relevant? What likelihood does that person have that using the data and tools available, they might be able to build a model that could form a valuable enough prediction that they might then be able to derive these other points as well? What, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's very good, and I think I'm going to say easy. You do need to go back to the year 12 textbooks and the first year uni textbooks and look up a couple of those normal distribution formulas, and I've included them there, and I'm happy to put all of them into the appendix and share online. But once you've got, you don't have to understand AFL. Once you've got an opinion on who you think will win the match and what the odds are on that particular team, whether it's from reading it from betting websites or opinions or putting together an average of various tips, you can very quickly get a very valuable model where you can have all these prices available to then automate and put them on the exchange.
Very nice. Thank you. Good answer.
I think that's mostly mine. I was going to mention the total game score, but I probably bored everyone enough with the stats as well. But that's fine, unless you want me to jump to the next slide.
No, sure. No, please.
You go there. So the total game score is exactly the same. This is exactly the same idea. I did the same idea with this. That at the moment they were using about 165 points was what the total game score was going to be, and using those same normal formulas on the previous slide, it says this is approximately the prices for the total game score for each of those different ranges. It's saying what's the chance that the total game score is between 150 to 160, 160 to 170. All of those probabilities, of course, by definition, add up to 1, and the reciprocal of those is the price, and that is the approximate fair price at the moment for all those prices on the total game score. And again, if you think the game score is going to be a little bit higher, you can very quickly calculate what all those prices are, and you can go, okay, I've got an opportunity now. I can either back against, or I can lay this, I can back this particular price based on the dollars that are available on the exchange. It only takes a small fluctuation, and suddenly you've got an opportunity there.
So you said that you add liquidity to quite a lot of markets on the exchange on AFL. How many markets would you normally be across within a standard game?
All of the score markets. So that's this one, total game score, the winning margin spread, the try bet, and the handicap and the under over total points. All of the score ones. I have respect for people that look at disposals and look at history and all that sort of stuff on the stats side and bet on all those ones. But anything that's related to a score, which is all the ones I've shown here tonight, I'm across, and that's where I'm market making, and that's where I've got dollars in every game.
And would you say that someone starting fresh, that it would be realistic and accessible for them to explore that set of market offerings as well, or should they stick with just their head-to-head because that's the simple one that everyone knows?
I think moving away, as I've shown here, if you have an opinion on head-to-head, it's a very simple calculation to explore and play with to have an opinion then on the rest of the game markets, because they are all interlinked, and they all feed off one another. If one moves, the others have to move by absolute definition. So it's a good place to start. And there's some great databases available. I use a really, really simple one. I put the link up at the very first page, but at ozsportsbetting.com, it's got a downloadable Excel file of all the history, total scores, margin scores, and you can see all these patterns. You can see all these patterns within the history because it's got prices that were on the corporates at kickoff and what the line was at the time, what the final result was at the time, and all these nice little graphs that you can play with are very accessible and easy to start to explore and model.
So speaking of betting odds, you said the odds at the corps. I've got a question here, and some really good questions coming through. Please do continue them. Question about combining historic stats with betting odds. So do you use historic prices as an input for your models, or just as more of a sense check for back testing purposes?
A bit of both. I do. I used to, before I would go off and put stuff on the exchange, I would have a check with what the corporates were offering. But I've now worked out that because I can calculate effectively what I know the corporates are going to be offering, I've kind of stopped doing that. So the only thing with the corporate prices, of course, is they've got a horrendous overround. All right. So as opposed to the Betfair prices, that's got a much tighter overround and almost close to fair value. So if you're going to use a corporate price, that's fine, but you have to back out the overround in order to get the fair price that they're effectively offering.
You have a rule of
paper on that I'm going to upload upload later on with Kerrin that shows an exercise on how to do that, because it's not a linear overround, but you can back it out and understand what the fair price that the corporates are.
Excellent. Is there a rule of thumb that you'd use for like what percentage overround you'd be looking at with a corp?
As I said, it's non-linear. So at the $2 mark, it's 1%. Up at the $5 to $10 mark, it's a slightly higher, a slightly different percentage. But you can calculate what that is by simply looking at what their current head-to-head line price is. Whether it's $1.91, you can do the calculation on that fairly quickly.
Excellent. I've got some other questions. We'll save those for a bit later. Thank you very much, Michael. I really like that relationship mapping effectively, because
I hope I
I
didn't
think
lose
for a
too
lot
many
of
people so that Bob's still got people to talk to. I didn't want everybody to turn off, but I want to emphasize the point that they're all related. So yeah, good.
They are. And I think that in terms of a view to people who don't necessarily bet AFL and or people who don't bet sports at all or model sports, I know coming into this, I was years ago when I started with Betfair, I was very confused by the breadth of markets that I saw, and I didn't necessarily understand the relationship. And I think this is a really clear way of seeing that there are relationships across them. Cool. Do you mind stopping sharing, and
yes,
we'll switch across.
I'd like to do that. Sort that out.
To Robert, and so we might is it Ivan you can control today? I think you are. Could you switch across from Michael? There we go, to Robert. So we'll get Michael off for a minute and then come back. Hey Robert, thank you very much for joining us. I imagine that some of the people watching tonight might know you. You've got quite a reputation around the space for your contributions to the AFL data community, and also for your Chilling with Charlie podcast. But to you, thank you very much for joining. I really do appreciate it. What could you give a bit more intro to your background, your experience, what you do off the exchange, and then share some of the insights that you're bringing tonight?
Yeah, sure. So I guess a bit about me. So I host like a podcast where I try to chat to people who do interesting stuff in sports analytics. So, it's available on all your favorite podcast providers. So please give it a listen, and 5 stars if possible. Did sort of stats at uni, still studying stats now. So quite enjoy watching any sort of sport really, but I also enjoy sort of analytical discussion around sports. So I felt as though within sort of Australian footy, which is my favourite sport, maybe that discussion was a bit sort of lacking previously. So thought that making data a bit more accessible to people would help improve that. So try to really push data accessibility, in particular with AFL, to people with the community for whatever it might be it sports betting, or you just have a blog, or maybe you really want to win your fantasy tipping comp, or whatever it might be.
There are definitely multiple places that you can utilize the data, right? Like, I know for a long time you were far more interested in the analysis than the betting, right? Same with someone like Tony Cook, who shared some of his things last year. Equally, it's the data that's his passion more than the betting, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it depends on, what you do it for. I think, betting can be fun. One of the, positive parts about, betting is it's a really, great way to assess maybe how your models are going, if that's sort of what you want to do. But yeah.
Oh, excellent. And I can attest, having listened to quite a few of your Chilling with Charlie podcasts, that you have some fascinating people on as guests, and I really enjoy them. But I also love that they're named after your dog, who,
yes,
having met, Charlie is gorgeous.
Yes. I'm a big fan of anything AFL related or dog related.
The best, right?
Yes.
It's gorgeous. So you were going to share a little bit of insights into data sources, right, and databases. So I suppose, well, maybe let's take a step back. I had my big spiel at the beginning of this about why I think that AFL is a good place for people to start. From your perspective, if you have someone who's got a strong set of analytical skills like you, why do you think that AFL is a good place for people to apply those skills if they're interested in sports modeling?
Yeah, so I guess the kind of thing would be, well, if you're interested in sports modeling and you have analytical skills, well, why not AFL? So the biggest barriers to any sort of modeling typically revolve around basically data, right? So if you're interested in a sport, you have the analytical skills, and the data is available, well, why not do AFL?
It's a fair answer. And I think maybe going even one step beyond that, there are an awful lot of sports where data isn't available, right?
Yeah, there's definitely, I mean, AFL's a really cool online community. It's grown a lot recently. So like I saw today on Twitter, Squiggle just uploaded their 8th new model to the website this year, which is, pretty remarkable from when you think about just like a few years ago, right? Might not have got 8 models in total on Squiggle, but now, there's 8 new models just this year. So I think one of the cool things, if you're interested in sports, AFL modeling, is especially nowadays, there's so much available online. A lot of the leaders, I think, in the analytical space, people like, Tony Cork, Max Barry and stuff, they're really helpful answering questions. They have really insightful, helpful blogs as well, which you can log on to, read, get ideas. If you're like a footy nuffy, maybe you think you have better ideas, but you can test them out yourself as well.
The thing that surprised me, again, a few years ago when I sort of started seeing more of this space, seeing the culture of AFL in Australia, I did not expect to see the quite sophisticated analytical community that exists online, particularly around the squiggle space. That really surprised me. And it's been awesome to watch that grow and develop over the past few years. Like you said, it's exploded quite a lot. But like you also said, the community in that space is so open to talk about things. Tony Corp will answer anyone on Twitter. And that's a really cool difference that I think, one of the beautiful things about the dev community is that open source mentality, and that people are prepared to, I know you're a contributor to fitzRoy, we'll talk about that in a minute, but that they're happy to share their insights and their skills a bit more than in other walks of life. And when you bring that together with a passion for a sport, it produces some pretty cool things.
Yeah, definitely.
So in terms of data sources, as we said, it's very hard to build a model if you don't have data. Where would you start if you were saying, okay, I want to build an AFL model? What would your starting point be?
So I'm a bit biased, obviously, but I would recommend sort of like you hop onto like Google, and then you just sort of give a search for fitzRoy, which is like an R package, and it basically makes getting data pretty easy for AFL. There's basically 2 sources. So you have like a GitHub version, which is like a development version, which means you get like the latest sort of things that people maybe have thought about would be cool to add. So for example, like the AFL website, AFLW data.
That's awesome.
Or you can just like hop onto a more stable version, which is on CRAN, which is just sort of like available like here. And then you just give it an install, and then you'd go away. So there's quite like a bit of data in fitzRoy. So like, for example, you just sort of like load it up and then sort of see what's available. So within the development version, we've got the coaches' votes. If you think that, I don't know, maybe at the end of the year, maybe you think coaches' votes really matter for predicting the Brownlow medal, whatever, test it out. You can get betting odds from FootyWire. So I don't know if you hopped on FootyWire, which is a pretty cool website. On the match summary page, it has the opening odds and the closing odds of the team and the line. So maybe you want to get that. You can get the fixture, which is pretty important, sort of if you want to do something a bit more programmatic and maybe put out tips for the week or something like that. You can get data from Squiggle, AFL tables. You can get player data from AFL tables, FootyWire, the AFL website, and a whole heap of other sources. So yeah, there's a lot of different data sources, a lot of different
Mm.
functions, and it sort of just makes doing stuff a little bit easier. So as an example, I was thinking like Betfair just did like a same game multi. So this isn't really like betting advice, but the first question would sort of just be, well, like before you bet, you should at least look up the data. So you might be thinking, okay, first, what do I need? I need disposals, right? Because that's one of the things within the same game multi, right? So you just sort of run this, get some data from using fitzRoy. So just getting data for the past 2 seasons, but really you can get it going back to 1897 if you want, depending on the data source.
1897.
Yeah, so the AFL tables goes back to 1897.
Wow.
Footy Wire goes back to 1965. And then depending on the variable you're after from the AFL website, it ranges from a mix of 2010 onwards.
A lot of modelers I know wouldn't go back to 2010 at the best of times. So that's an impressive range of data if you want it.
Yeah, so a few questions sort of have popped up in the chat over fantasy and stuff. So if you look at like the player stats involved, so this is by game. So you do get like, you know, your fantasy scores, but you also get the statistics that are involved in calculating your fantasy score. Like we know that, for example, kicks are worth 3 points. And maybe, you know, just sort of see how it goes. So you have all this stuff available. You got your team, you got a match ID, you got, you know, how many goals they got behinds, what was the score, what was the margin, who won. People always talk about maybe weather affecting totals or player stats. So also include the weather as per the AFL website. Got the player names, and then you got, you know, their individual game statistics. And then obviously from there, if you wanted to, you could aggregate up to maybe by game. So to come up with maybe team ratings for, I don't know, maybe you want to build an ELO for kicks or something, whatever it might be. Yeah, so then within that, you might just sort of go, okay, let's get the disposals. And then let's just look at players' last 20 games. And then I think the market on Betfair was a few players to get 20 plus touches or 25 plus touches. So you can use, you know, like whatever your favorite like stats package is. So here I'm using Tidyverse. You might be more of like a data table person or Baser, whatever. Do a little bit of coding, which like it looks quite confronting, but not only is, if people think like the AFL community is pretty good with helping people out, like the R community is really helpful with people helping them out. So a lot of this you can just get off a mix of Stack Overflow, or even hop on sort of online R communities and just ask questions and they'll answer eventually. So that's pretty cool as well. So
Nice. Ours nice that a bit like Python, it's pretty human readable. You know, there are a lot of languages that if you're just scanning through, it's hard for a non-language of choice programmer to be able to follow it. Whereas I at least find R it makes sense. Just, you know, it's fairly logical to follow what's going on, which is nice.
Yeah, so run a bit of code like this, and then you can sort of tell, you know, in their past 20 games, how many times a player has cleared a certain amount of disposals, right? And maybe that forms the first leg of your same game multi. Maybe you have like a pretty fancy table like Michael showed earlier, where you hopped onto corporate bookmakers, maybe like Tab or Sportsbet or whatever, and started documenting or had access to how they did the prices. So whether they would clear 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, which are becoming pretty popular now. Or maybe you want to do this for your fantasy team, right? So maybe you're thinking, hey, round one, got to lock in a player in the midfield. Hopefully they get a lot of touches. So maybe instead of doing this by disposals, maybe you break it up by fantasy points, right? And see how often they fall into certain fantasy point buckets. So I think that's one part of the legs with the multi. And then the other leg with the multi is just looking at some squiggle tips. So as you know, Squiggle's like a pretty cool website, which I will swap screen quickly and show. So you can go Squiggle. And here it has a whole heap of things, like a whole bunch of different websites, and they've given like a winning percentage, a margin, tells you when it's been updated, that sort of thing. It's pretty cool. So then you might hop onto Squiggle and you might think, hey, I want to see what's the tip for today. Right, so you can do that by filtering for year, round one, game ID is tonight's game. And then you might just have a look at how everyone tipped. So here, what we can see quite quickly, hopefully, is that everyone's basically tipped Melbourne today. Right, so that's not like a thing to go out and do, but just for reference, everyone today, all the models. So if you haven't built a model yet, but you're just sort of wondering what other people have done, everyone's model so far has been on Melbourne. So that's kind of cool.
There are some really useful ways you could use that data too. Like we've had some interesting meetups before when we've talked, particularly in the racing world, about using tips and ratings from tipsters and other people who often will not show their historic performance as clearly as these guys will, and might not be in it for quite the same reason. The value of using those as a feature in your model, and obviously you could do that here, but if I were going through this, I'd be using this as my sense check, particularly while building a model. Like, am I getting vaguely the same outputs as the people who are good at this?
Yeah, so you might follow, for example, Glyco ratings and be like, oh yeah, it's kind of cool if my model's in line with Glyco ratings. Or maybe you're just at a different part of your modeling sort of like process. So maybe instead of someone who builds models, maybe you're a bit more like, say, Michael, and maybe do a bit more market making. So that can be quite hard if you don't have a model to begin with, right? So you could do that using maybe some of these outputs. You can do it to test all sorts of cool ideas you might have in your head. So for example, people like to talk about like an ensemble of models. So you could take all the models for the past few years and see if maybe an ensemble of these models did better than any one individual model.
Kind of like an ETF of AFL models.
Yeah, you can do a whole heap of things with the squiggle data. How I like to do it is I like to hop on the Monash probabilistic tipping comp, and they actually ask you for like a mean and a standard deviation. So I just like to take the standard deviation from all the squiggle tipsters actually, and the mean prediction from there, and kind of like cheat my way instead of sort of working it out myself.
I managed to get my very first year at Betfair. I was trying to have people like me. So I entered the AFL tipping competition and I came second, which is horrifying because I also managed to tip both Dusty and Martin for two different things, thinking they were two different people. I managed to come second just through a very similar approach to using wisdom of the crowd. And it worked. So there's value in it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is just it's always good to just look at different data sources. You can, I mean, the cool thing about what Squiggle does is it provides links to all these people who have submitted their own models to be put on Squiggle. So any one of these models you can actually read about yourself. So if you wanted to go away and build a model like, matter of stats, you can hop on Tony's blog and read how he created his model using things like scoring shots.
Again, that comes back to what you were saying earlier about the open source nature of the community. That if you actually want to learn and you're prepared to learn, there's an awful lot of resources here to help with that, right?
Yeah, so let's break it down just a little bit more. So what I thought I'd do is, okay, so if you're completely new to modeling, so now you know that fitzRoy is available, so you will have data and you're just like, well, I actually don't know how to fit a model. So what I would do is I would go like modeling AFL games GitHub, and then I don't know, click on one, right? So I don't know who this person is, but they've uploaded it on GitHub. Click on their R, and then I'd go something like, okay, so now I have data, right, from fitzRoy, or I could use these CSVs. Maybe I want to use fitzRoy to add in some different sort of covariates. Like I don't have to use these covariates. Maybe I want to use more player-based information than teams. So maybe I'd add that in. And then you can sort of see exactly how they fit it. And if you wanted to, you could just copy that code, run it yourself, do things like change the variables up yourself, maybe use the same variables, but maybe create some ratios, that sort of thing, see if they perform a little bit better. And there's a whole heap. So you can try that one. You could try, this one. You could try a whole heap. So that's kind of what I would do. Or if you wanted to, you could look at like similar sports, like maybe something like NBA, right? So NBA is also pretty modelable, and a lot of people use similar modeling techniques to AFL as they do NBA. This one's like a Python notebook, but more or less the same thing, right? Once you get your data, all you really need is like an example. And once you can run an example, you can change an example and input in your own sort of ideas, your own beliefs, test out your own things. So maybe you want to move from only using scores to maybe using some sort of summary statistic of player information instead of scores, or whatever it might be.
I'll get Ivan to drop in a link, but on the Automation Hub, we've got a couple of tutorials that do similar things as well for a starting baseline AFL model. I think one's in Excel and then one's in Python. Again, there's R here, which have a variation on, but I do agree with you that there's a lot of value in having a starting point, because a blank canvas is scary and no one likes to start with a blank page. And, once you get started, it's easy enough to edit, right?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so I guess I kind of want to stress that as like a point, right? So the main barriers are typically data, which hopefully everyone sort of sees now is hopefully pretty readily available, right? Then the next part is just getting a starting point and just giving it a crack. So there's stuff available on Betfair, like the GitHub there, right? So, and there's also everyone else's GitHub, right? There's, a massive online community out there that has written code ready to be tweaked for you to give it a go modeling. So yeah, why not AFL?
I couldn't have put that better. That's excellent. And thanks for sharing that insight there too. I really appreciate that. Michael, do we want to get you back? Lean on Ivan to do that, I think. I promised you guys that I'd finish at 7 for kickoff. I absolutely love 100% market, and the Match Fish and I have been sitting at 100% all day with some very nice liquidity there, and that makes me very happy. I got a couple of questions here I wanted to bounce out to either or both of you. So one is around time series analysis. Do you have an opinion on whether time series analysis is valuable in an AFL model, or is a regression-based approach more reliable?
I've done lots of time series analysis in my time, and I think that would be a step possibly too far. It's like a real fine tuning, and I don't think you need to get to that sort of level initially. I think the regression based approaches that I'm sure Robert uses and I've used and doing regression analysis and fitting is more than sufficient. But that could be a step further. But I don't go that far in my analysis.
What about you, Robert? Have you played in that world?
Yeah, I would say why not just give both a crack and see what works best for you. So it might be the way you think about modeling AFL is really suited to like a time series approach. And that's fine. That's cool. Right. I wouldn't really say maybe one's like strictly better than the other, but more so like what suits you and what's your background. So there are a lot of people who maybe come from financial markets, for example, and that's like a whole heap of time series. So if you're more comfortable with that, you know more about that, give that a crack. If you're more comfortable with regression, then do regression. I'm sure there'd be a lot of people using sort of machine learning based approaches as well on Betfair. And if that's your background, give it a crack.
Yeah.
I think that from a Betfair perspective, a lot of the smartest, best minds that I know on the exchange model and bet AFL, which again, like I said, not to be too putting things in boxes, but I was a bit surprised when I came to the exchange just how many really smart people were passionately interested in modeling AFL. And I've seen some excellent success stories where people have come and built really good AFL models without ever watching a game.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily know anything about it.
I'd be really interested, just harking back to what Robert was showing before, that all those people that had used models to show what the margin was for Melbourne, the wisdom of the crowd, if you added up all those margins and took the average, I reckon you're going to be pretty close to what's going to happen tonight. That's always the way it's going to be, and leading from that to lead into what I was showing, that if you've then got the margin, then you've got an opinion on what the match odds should be, and therefore you can bet it. And as simple as that, by grabbing a whole bunch of predictions from other people, you can suddenly form an opinion and start betting. And there's the most simple model you could have, the average of what everyone else thinks, and using that into to calculate your match odds.
I'd say, but probably better than a lot of other models that are going around. The sum of everyone. Question here around a few things around player points. Do either of you play much in player markets instead of the more sort of score related markets?
I don't, unfortunately.
Yeah. So what was the question around player points?
So we've got a couple of them. So, what's your approach to combining historical stats and odds to predict player points? Do you have any insights on how you do that? And then particularly with a bit of a view to, like you inferred earlier, fantasy points and draft stars. Is there any insight into that space you can share?
Yeah, so I guess how maybe you might use, betting odds and player data is the same way you might use betting odds and team level information in setting them, right? I mean, you're just trying to do like a different market. So presumably you're using odds for the player markets as well as the player statistic you're trying to bet. So I think the approaches are more or less the same. It more depends on what you're trying to do. So I have seen people try to fit, sort of like ELO models with regards to disposals to sort of see how teams go against each other, maybe with disposal differential. And then maybe based on who they think they might win the disposal differential, then maybe they'll tailor their player betting towards that, for example. With regards to the Draft Stars AFL fantasy stuff. So I think like on Monday night did like a YouTube live thing where there was Australia's two-time fantasy winner, Selby. He's got himself a data scientist called Wonkster. So, and she used linear programming to do the best fantasy team. So if you think about picking a fantasy team or draft stars, you've got to make all these different decisions between what's your expectation of points versus the prices. It's a very hard optimization problem to do all in your head, or the different combinations. Whereas if you can just run like a program through it, it gives you a solution, and you can use that as a starting point.
So linear programming knapsack problem, basically, isn't it? From memory, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Yes.
That's really interesting. And yeah, thanks very much, Robert, for taking us through some of the same game multis. So if you guys hadn't noticed, we did launch those on AFL today, which we're pretty excited about. Obviously, it's an exchange version of a same game multi. You don't get to pick your own selections. I would love to do that, but the technology it's not just the technology, but the thing with the exchange, obviously you need two sides of the coin. So you need someone who thinks that your crazy set of selections is the same as the exact inverse of what they think the crazy set of selections should be. So it's our defined set of same game multis, but have a look. We think they're interesting. We're pretty passionate about them, and they've been pretty well received today already. So would love thoughts from the rest of the community on what you think about them. Anyone who's interested in any liquidity in that space, let me know. Always open to conversations on that. Just before we wrap up, it would be remiss of me to ask, do either of you have any opinions, predictions for the rest of the season? So obviously, we've been talking today match to match betting, but there's also season markets, which are always really interesting to look at. And there's the Brownlow, which you could sort of call the season market as well. Any thoughts that your models have shown you that the wider market might not?
I can give the very boring answer, because as you've seen from my information in my presentation tonight, I let each game speak to me based on wisdom of the crowd, what the figures are showing, and how they all interrelate to one another. So predictions on who's going to win the flag, or who's going to climb higher than they were last year, that's over to the stats guy sitting in here. From my perspective, I grab my prices every week, what's currently being bet, how they all intertwine, and I let that move. I don't know how many rule changes are going to affect the overall total scores this season. But again, the people that are modelling it will make some predictions, and I will use those to drive and derive all the other figures.
What about you, Robert? Do you have any thoughts?
No, not really. I'm just kind of like an Eagles nuffian, hoping that the season doesn't go as bad as people sort of say. I guess one of the kind of interesting things, this year is, and what I'm really excited to read about different people's takes online is, like we had two pretty weird football seasons with COVID, maybe like a season with sort of reduced game time. I'm kind of interested to see, obviously previous games history go into models. So I'm kind of interested to see how people take the previous 2 years back to this year, which is hopefully going to be roughly a pretty normal year, and see how people are approaching that problem.
Don't jinx it. Okay.
Yeah.
Don't jinx it. Had quite enough abnormal years. Thank you both so much. There's never enough time for these things, but I did promise we'd finish by 7. If anyone's keen to talk to these guys, they're both wonderfully generous in their time and insights. And if you are keen to chat more, hit them up on Slack. Both really nice guys, and I'm sure would answer your thoughts and questions, particularly if you post them in the Meetups channel, because you're more likely to get a conversation, which is even more valuable. Thank you both. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Robert. I really appreciate it, and I will hopefully catch up with you both in person someday when we're lucky. I hope you guys enjoy this AFL season. I hope you learned something tonight. Hit us up if you've got any questions. You know where we are, automation@betfair.com.au. And just to finish, what we do is supposed to be fun. Modeling's supposed to be fun, particularly if it's not what you're doing for your work. Betting's supposed to be fun, and it's supposed to be healthy, and it's supposed to be in a balance that works for you. So please make sure that that's the case. And as always, gamble responsibly. Thank you all, and I will see you later. Have a good night, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Enjoy the game.
Yeah.